Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to go over the uranium investment thesis. We're going to take a look at the fundamentals that make this trade so attractive and review the current market conditions going into 2022. I would like to start this off by giving a brief explanation of energy commodity cyclicality, and I will be using uranium's history to do so. I'll do my best to keep this as brief as possible, as to spare the more experienced viewers time. I do, however, believe that this is the core fundamental for the investment into this space. I think that having an in-depth understanding of the nature of energy commodity cyclicality and how it affects the commodity price is essential before entering into the space. Now, the first thing we're going to look at is a nuclear electricity production. Now, the thing that I really want you to take from this graph, and it's kind of impossible to miss, right, is that nuclear electricity production has been on a steady, consistent increase since the 1970s. Now, with that in mind, let's move on to what the price of uranium has looked like over that same period. Taking a look at the uranium price over the same period of time that we experienced increasing or consistent demand, it becomes clear that the main driver of uranium cyclicality is supply. It's for this reason that we'll be unpacking the supply side fundamentals first. Though demand is important and uranium has a great demand fundamental, when you understand uranium supply fundamentals, you'll understand its cyclicality. If we want to understand uranium's cyclicality, you must understand how producers respond to a bear market in the commodity they produce. When a commodity, in our case uranium, goes into a bear market, the commodity becomes unprofitable to extract, which causes a contraction in production as producers go offline. Said contraction will continue unless the cost of the commodity increases. When looking for commodity investments, you want to find markets where the current price of the commodity is causing a contraction in production while demand stays consistent or increases. While a commodity experiences a contraction in supply due to price falling while demand remains, upward fragility is introduced to the space, creating an opportunity for asymmetrical returns as an increase in the commodity's price will be forced when supply constraints are realized and production must increase. We know that the global uranium demand requires a higher uranium price, as the current uranium price is below the incentive for production to increase and meet demand in a meaningful way. If the price of uranium doesn't increase, uranium supply will remain in a deficit, and energy shortages will inevitably become a reality. This fact turns the uranium investment thesis into one where you're placing bets on when nuclear reactors run out of fuel. These market dynamics create a situation where the majority of the risk lies in misunderstanding the time it takes for supply to tighten, or overholding and missing the top of the cycle, losing everything due to a rapid expansion of production in response to a price increase. A good analogy for this trade would be like watching a NASCAR race where drivers aren't allowed to refuel on fuel and drive until their cars run out of gas. Essentially, we're placing bets that the cars run out of fuel within a certain time frame. The question is not if the drivers will run out of fuel, that is an inevitability. Rather, the question is when. It's important to realize that just because you're dealing with an inevitability does not necessarily mean that the investment is riskless. So let's go over some of those risks now.
Still unfolding in Japan, where tonight nuclear officials there are warning of a possible nuclear reactor meltdown. They have been watching 3 facilities near the epicenter with concern all day, and at one of them, fuel rods are now exposed, and if they stay that way, they could release radioactivity and a disaster of unknown proportion.
It was the first step in a nuclear nightmare. As far as we know at this hour, no worse than that. But a government official said that a breakdown in an atomic power plant in Pennsylvania today is probably the worst nuclear reactor accident to date.
Though nuclear accidents are likely the most over-sensationalized risks, there is no doubting that the unpredictability and uncertainty around nuclear disasters incites a certain level of anxiety around the commodity that simply cannot be ignored. Another risk is miscalculating the amount of time it will take for the market to tighten. Depending on how you are gaining exposure to the space, this miscalculation can have devastating consequences. Specifically, if you are using unprofitable uranium producers to gain exposure, the longer the uranium bear market lasts, the longer the company you're holding will remain unprofitable. If uranium investors get ahead of themselves and corporately push uranium mining stock prices to a higher level that they don't deserve, when the mistake of their overzealousness is realized, mining stocks can enter unrelenting drawdowns. Many uranium investors noticed this in the months coming into 2022, when rate hike fears overwhelmed the market, causing an almost universal fall in risk asset prices. Speculative uranium stocks were not an exception to this, with many uranium stocks dropping almost 50% and most still off their November highs. Now that we've reviewed what I believe to be the base fundamentals for this investment, we can now take a look at some of the tailwinds for the uranium market as the uranium price approaches the $60 a pound mark, getting it closer to the cost needed to increase production in a meaningful way. In the list of tailwinds, we'll be going over the revenge of the old economy, geopolitical tensions, and underfeeding versus overfeeding. For an introduction into this concept, I'll let Jeff Curry, the person who I coined the term from, and who has influenced many of my own ideas about commodity investment, explain what the revenge of the old economy is.
We're trying to, exactly understand what's going on. There's a supply crunch. Sure, gas here in the UK is almost impossible to get through, and partly it's, of course, because of Brexit and the lack of drivers. But is this a European/UK energy security problem, and how long can it continue?
Absolutely not. It is a global phenomena, and it's not unique to energy. It's across the entire old economy. Look at trucking in the U.S. These problems were with us long before COVID. We call it the revenge of the old economy. Poor returns saw capital redirected away from the old economy to the new economy. Let me ask you, what do you want to own, a FANG stock or a energy company? The returns in FANGs were much better, so all the capital got redirected to the new economy, choking off the capital that you needed to grow the old economy.
The energy crisis we are dealing with today is a part of the revenge of the old economy. Underinvestment in oil, natural gas, coal, and uranium has caused an energy crisis that will remind the world of the importance of energy security and shock the modern economic system, which for the past few years has been rejecting investment in the traditional energy complex in pursuit of ESG investments. This pursuit of ESG investments and green energy politics has functionally turned into a tax on the traditional energy sector by forcing underinvestment in oil, coal, natural gas, and uranium, causing energy prices to rise as a symptom. Not only does this functionally turn into a tax without representation, it's a tax where the revenues flow to countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia. The outcome of this institutional neglect towards the old energy complex can be clearly seen when we view the spike in natural gas, coal, and oil prices over the past few years. Prices for the old energy complex have skyrocketed, which led to Russia gaining more wealth and geopolitical control through energy. This allowed Russia to leverage their energy exports and their invasion of Ukraine, furthering the energy crisis as the West seeks to separate itself from Russian commodity. I think this is the perfect time to transition into our next tailwind, geopolitical tensions. Though the revenge of the old economy is something with much more depth to it, for this video, I think a high-level understanding of the tailwind is all that's needed. In the future, I plan on doing a full-length video on this subject as I find it salient for investors looking for opportunities within the next decade.
бейбіт шеру өтіп жатыр. 30 жыл жиналған пружина бүгін жазылды. Біз жаңа мемлекетіміздің бетін ашып жатырмыз. Соған сіздер куә болыңыздар.
Нам хорошо известно, они бесчинствуют в настоящее время в Алмате, в других городах, захватывают здания инфраструктуры и, самое главное, захватывают помещения, где находится стрелковое оружие.
When thinking about geopolitical tensions in commodities, I believe the best approach is looking at the geographical locations for the production of said commodity and locating any points in the supply that could potentially experience disruptions or are located in risky nations. If a large portion of the commodity supply is sourced from an area rife with conflict, you have added an extra layer of fragility to the commodity supply. In the case of uranium, this is undeniably the case. Kazakhstan, a country located on the border of Russia, makes up nearly 40% of the global supply of uranium. Folks, this is a serious form of added fragility at the present time. There is so much uncertainty in the region and surrounding regions at the moment. Nothing stable today is guaranteed to be stable tomorrow, and Kazakhstan's relationship with Russia during times of escalating tensions between Russia and the West is a serious cause for concern. This, however, is just the tip of the iceberg for the uranium investor. See, the uranium market is fairly complex due to its opaqueness. There are many other geopolitical factors at play when it comes to the uranium supply for reactors, especially when it comes to uranium enrichment and conversion into UF6, which is a market largely controlled by Russia. On the screen now, I have the process uranium goes through to get from mined ore to fuel assembly. As you can see, the process involves several separate steps, many of which require services provided by separate nations. One layer of geopolitical concern is located in the very first step, uranium ore, which was represented by the pie chart I showed earlier. 40% of U3O8 originates from Kazakhstan, but what about enrichment services? The issue with enrichment services is that it's highly political and restricted due to its potential to create weapons-grade uranium, or highly enriched uranium. It's for this reason that nearly 90% of uranium enrichment services source from the 5 nuclear power nations, Russia being a large provider of this service. For the United States, Russia makes up 22% of the total enriched uranium services provided to US reactors. This by itself is cause for concern. This gets even more concerning when you realize that 90% of the enrichment services provided to US reactors are held in long-term contracts, meaning if these contracts were to be abruptly ended, utilities would have to scramble to resecure these far-out pounds. Now, you might be wondering, how is tightening in the enrichment services market going to impact the fuel cycle and the uranium price? Which perfectly places us into the next tailwind, underfeeding versus overfeeding. On the screen I have a tweet from John Quakes discussing the uranium deficit. What's relevant for this topic is the 25 million pounds of secondary supply that has been coming into the market through something called underfeeding. If we look back at the fuel cycle chart I posted earlier, underfeeding is a phenomena that occurs due to the enrichment process. Essentially, during times of low demand, the machines that enrich uranium run under full capacity, resulting in the machines dispensing enriched uranium and some of the uranium which was initially inserted. The partial refund of original uranium consumed turns into a source of consistent secondary supply in the market. Fuel buyers can also input that refunded uranium on the next order, reducing the demand and price for uranium. If, however, the enrichment market experiences elevated demand, uranium enrichers go from underfeeding to overfeeding in order to meet the influx in demand. Overfeeding is when enrichment infrastructure runs at a higher capacity, causing more unenriched uranium to be inserted and only enriched uranium to dispense from the machines, removing the refund previously received. What does this mean for us as investors? Not only does overfeeding remove the refund received when enrichers are underfeeding, the enrichment process goes from being a source of secondary supply to secondary demand. When enrichers switch from underfeeding to overfeeding, the 20 million added supply from underfeeding will turn into 20 million extra demand, causing the 40 million pound deficit in the market to double to 80 million pounds. To give you an idea of the size of this deficit, SPUT currently controls around 50 million pounds of uranium, and the added demand from SPUT has changed the market in a major way in the past year. With enrichment costs up 36% this past month, this tailwind is currently very relevant, especially as tensions between the US and Russia continue to escalate.
Just 1 week ago, we, you, the city, and all the communities around it were shaken by a truly powerful force.
Over the past few years, energy has increasingly become an ideology. I expect this trend to continue through the next decade, bringing with it a heightened level of politicalization. Though the politicalization of energy is the very thing that has gotten us into our current situation, I do not believe this trend will reverse until real consequences are faced on a global scale. If there's anything I want you to take from this video, it's this. Though we are currently approaching times of uncertainty around energy, partially due to poor policy decisions from politicians and capital neglecting the sector, I believe the pain ahead will engender a silver lining. Not only is nuclear energy the densest form of energy, it's also the greenest. The consequences of the revenge of the old economy will likely further investment in nuclear energy, as it becomes clear a green form of baseload power will be necessary to maintain energy security in an evolving energy environment. Whether you are for green energy or against it, we have to keep nuclear.